Okay, so fiscal policy. Talked about this a little bit before, but now we're getting into the details of it. So fiscal policy deals with the fiscal side of things of the government. So either government spending or government revenue, which is taxation. Any change in those to stimulate the economy or to contract the economy is considered fiscal policy. So an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes would be expansionary fiscal policy. If we're talking about contractionary fiscal policy, well, decrease in government spending or increase in taxes. When it's expansionary, either of these will stimulate aggregate demand and shift it to the right. So that's that for now. One note, just so I don't make sure I don't forget, is if we think about expansionary monetary policy, which was an increase in money supply, drop, or keeping interest rates lower, lowering interest rates, that process could happen like forever. You could keep interest rates at rock bottom and increase the amount of money, print more money, time and time again. You're not going to hit a limit. The only thing that you're going to do is you're going to create a lot of inflation, potentially hyperinflation, but you're not necessarily limited. With expansionary fiscal policy, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that if you're going to increase government spending, and even if you don't change taxes, if you keep on increasing government spending year after year, or you keep dropping taxes year after year, something's going to happen. What's that thing? Well, that thing that's going to happen eventually is that you're going to run out of money. You're going to be way too indebted, and you're going to be one of those countries that just can't borrow anymore, or if it borrows, it's going to have to pay a really high interest rate because it is at risk of default. If you look at countries such as Greece and year around 2010-ish, you'll see that countries like that have had really bad fiscal situations. So any country like that has a limit. Even the United States, who has access to a lot of borrowing, when it keeps on increasing its debt level, it leads to a situation that eventually it might run out and might not be able to keep on increasing government spending or decrease taxes. It's going to have to flip over and do the opposite. It's going to have to hike increase taxes and drop government spending. So just something to keep in mind as one of the limitations of fiscal policy. One thing that we need to understand well to understand monetary policy is the idea of the multiplier effect. So if the government decides to give $1 million to Bishop's University to renovate residences, well, $1 million is not that much, but let's say for explanation, that's the example here. Well, national income, as soon as they increase government spending by $1 million, well, since C plus I plus G plus net exports, G increases by 1 million. Well, obviously GDP is going to increase, Y or GDP, whatever you want to call it, is going to increase by 1 million as well. But as those people that didn't really have a job or had a job but now are getting a bigger contract, get extra income, they're going to spend that money elsewhere. You'll see a lot of these people that are put on this contract, they might buy a new truck for the company. If it's just their revenue, they might buy new clothes, they go to the movie, go to the restaurant, buy new sporting gear, anything else. So that amount of income, some of it will be spent once again in the Canadian economy in goods and services, leading to a multiplying effect. How can we understand this multiplying effect? Well, there's a few ways to see this, and I'll run through this. The next three slides kind of replicate each other, so I'll just kind of go through this a little bit rapidly. This triangle here always represents the change in, so it's the change in consumption for a certain change in income. So if you increase your income by $1 and you increase your consumption by 70 cents, your marginal propensity to consume is 70%. Some people in other textbooks, which I'm reviewing right now, say that this marginal propensity to consume will be small if you're winning the lottery or a one-shot deal, but if it's your permanent income, you get a massive raise because you got a promotion and it's going to go up on all your income on future years. well, you're going to spend a lot of that money. It all depends. It's really dependent of the situation. So you have to be aware of what's the marginal propensity to consume or spend of your population. This is a very simple context. Let's make it a little bit more complicated. So calculating this multiplier effect is 1 over 1 minus MPC. If I follow this textbook, if I go into the open economy, I have to consider the amount of money I spend on imports. So that multiplying effect, which was of 5 times in the previous scenario, with only consuming domestically, as soon as I start importing some of that, spending 10 cents of that dollar on imported goods and not domestically produced goods, it means I'm spending less here, so the multiplying effect is smaller. So the big thing to keep in mind in this whole process, there's different equations here to kind of figure it out. And the way that they set it up, they don't really consider taxes all that much. But when you get an extra dollar, some of that income goes to consumption, some of that income goes to savings, some of it goes to taxes, some of it goes to imports. So the way I like to set it up is just think, well, I have an extra dollar. If I earn an extra dollar of gross income, so I'll go an extra step than they do. You could do it their way, which essentially they're talking about like your marginal propensity to consume out of an extra dollar of net income. But typically you have an extra amount of money, gross income. Well, part of your income will go to taxes, and part of your income will get deposited in your bank account, which will be your net income or your disposable income. Out of that disposable income, you're going to consume a portion and you're going to save a portion. And out of the portion consumed, you're going to buy some Canadian goods and services, and you're going to buy some imported goods. The number that you want to put in that denominator to calculate the spending multiplier is going to be whatever number gets down here. So let's say here you get an extra $100, and over here you spend $50 on Canadian goods and services. Well, it's that 50 over that 100 is going to represent that 50% is how much you spend. And then if you calculate the multiplying process, you're going to have 1 over 1 minus 50%, and it's 1 over 0.5 as well. It's going to be, you're going to multiply that initial government spending by 2. So what can happen here? Well, if I import more, so let's say all of a sudden 10 of those dollars goes towards imported goods, well, now I only have 40 here. If I have 40, this number here gets smaller, therefore the number here, the denominator, gets bigger, this multiplying effect gets smaller. If I get taxed more, and this goes down even further, well then, once again, it's going to get smaller, and I'm going to have a smaller multiplying effect. So different ways to increasing the multiplying effect is if we have a drop in income tax, which could be one of the other ways of fiscal policy, well, drop in taxes lead to more money available for consumers, leads to more consumption, but it leads to a greater multiplying effect. If we encourage people to spend less on imported goods, we're increasing the multiplying effect as well. And if we encourage people to spend more now and save less, we're increasing the multiplying effect as well. So ideally, we're trying to get as much of those extra dollars to come here to have the biggest bang for the buck. And that's why, if you think about any kind of recession, that you'll often hear the politicians, what they're trying to promote before stimulating the economy is they're going to try to ask you to buy local, so buy less imported goods, and they're going to try to convince you that the economy is getting back together so that you're not fearful of losing your job, and that you're keeping as much of your money aside because you think, well, I might lose my job, so I want to make sure I survive later on. If you're not fearful and you think the economy is going to recover, you're going to spend a larger portion of your income. Because if all of a sudden you spend like a very small amount of your income and you decide to save most of it, let's say here you only spend $10 of that 100, well, the multiplying effect will be extremely small. So different things that may happen with the government. So what would happen if you remove taxes or removed imports? It's not that you remove it, but if you minimize it, it's going to increase the multiplying effect. So here's one thing to keep in mind. In Chapter 7, we said that savings leads to more investment, which is good for economic growth. And here we say that if people spend a greater fraction of their income, there's a greater multiplying effect, leading to an increase in production, potentially better economic recovery. So how can a greater savings rate both be good and bad for the economy? Well, if we think very short run, greater savings rate is going to lead to less spending, which is going to lead to less jobs needed and a slower recovery. If we could encourage spending more and less saving, it's going to let the economy recover more rapidly. So from a short run perspective, consumption is good because it's going to drive us out of a recession. But from a long run perspective, having a country that spends most of their income and doesn't save that much leads to a situation that that country won't have much capital goods, investment goods in the future, which leads to a situation where their economic growth won't be as high. So it depends if you're thinking long run or short run. In the long run, ideally we have a big enough savings rate. But from time to time, when we're going through a recession, we want to make sure that that savings rate doesn't spike up because people are fearful of the economic situation. So if it stays stable, it's not that big of a deal. But if it spikes, that's where the problem is. So you want to avoid that. And even if it was like stable, that people save like 30% of their income, you might want them to just try to spend a little bit more temporarily to let the economy recover more. But the big problem is when people start saving a lot more based on fear. And it's normal for them to do so. It's just if you want the economy to recover, you're kind of going against the recovery by limiting your spending because you're cutting other people's jobs, which are cutting other people's jobs, which have this negative impact on society. We've talked about this before when we were talking about budget deficits, but here just a reminder that when we increase government spending, it leads to less public saving, and less public saving will lead to a higher interest rate and to less investment sometimes. But in an open economy, if you still have access to savings from abroad, that crowding out effect may be minimized to a certain extent. And there's also the crowding effect on net exports, that if you have less savings, less public saving, it's going to increase interest rates, which will decrease net capital outflow and will decrease net exports. So the big thing to keep in mind in this whole process of monetary policy and fiscal policy is that we want to make sure that the Bank of Canada and the government, politicians, move in the same kind of direction. We have to keep in mind what's going on with the exchange rate, how they're controlling the exchange rate or not, to see this crowding out effect or not. If they were to keep the exchange rate fixed, a change in government spending will lead to a big change in aggregate demand. If they don't keep it fixed, a change in government spending gets these crowding out effects, which minimizes its positive impact on aggregate demand. So next up, we're going to kind of compare the two a little bit more and add a little bit more comments. And that will be it for this pretty big and substantial chapter.